Hello, my name is Sue Shulcock and I'm a facilitator with Northcott Early Childhood Early Intervention. I'd just like to acknowledge this is a re-recording of the Zoom session with HPMI, NDIS and children under 7, much simpler than you think. Due to some technical issues we had on the evening, we did decide it was best to re-record this session, complete with the slideshow, commentary and questions and answers. So this will make for a fairly concise recording for you as well. So on the evening, we were introduced by Dr. Erica Gomes, myself, Sue Shulcock. I'm the capacity building facilitator for Northcott Early Childhood Early Intervention in the Hunter. And also we had Sue Lloyd, the service manager for Northcott Early Childhood Early Intervention in the Hunter, New England. So in my role as facilitator with Northcott, essentially this is an engagement role, working with community, allied health, early learning and community service organisations. And Northcott is really the community face of NDIS for children 0 to 6-year-old, or that space, and we support families who have concerns for their child's development. Sue Lloyd was also present, as I said, service manager for the Hunter New England region, letting us know that in the Hunter New England, we have a very similar footprint to the Hunter New England Health. Sue's role is to lead and manage team leaders and coordinators, and letting us know that we have offices in Moree, Tamworth, Maitland and Mayfield, with standalone coordinators at both Muswellbrook and Inverell. So operations-wise, as children come into the scheme, they're then directed to one of the offices that we mentioned. We're actually going to take you to a slideshow now, so if you bear with me for just a second, we will organise that. And here we go. So thank you to everyone who attended the other evening. Such busy times, such long days. We do hope to hopefully save you a little bit of time maybe, and perhaps some vicarious stress, by helping you to support families who may repeatedly return because they're unsure of how best to support their child with who they have developmental concerns for. Before we go any further, I would just like to acknowledge that we're all standing on First Nations land, and pay my respects to elders who are guiding us from the past, in the present, and who will be in the future. So early childhood, early intervention. Today we'll be providing an overview of access and pathways for families wishing to apply for their child, the importance of development strategies, the difference between developmental delay and disability, chatting in Q&A around the barriers to accessing supports, and ideas around how to have a whole of practice approach to supporting families. And from here on in, I'll refer to early childhood, early intervention as ECEI, just to make things a little easier. So what is the NDIS? It's an insurance scheme model, and the main difference between NDIS and previous models is that the previous funding was block funded. With NDIS, the funding's very much based on the individual needs. The other thing that's changed is the language. The language is supports-based rather than funding or dollar value based. And NDIS considers what supports are required and the frequency of those supports. In regards to choice and control, it is about the type of support they require, but also about how the plan will be managed. Agency, plan, or self-managed. So plan or self-managed allows for flexibility, and it allows people to link in with non-NDIS registered providers. For example, a provider that's APRA approved, but not necessarily registered with NDIS. And that's quite helpful in those rural and remote areas where we have fewer service providers. Another example of choice and control is that families are able to decide if they have supports delivered on an individual or a group basis, for example, or a combination of the two. So being a national scheme, it ensures that a child's plan is transportable. So for example, if a family moves interstate, for example, a RAF family moves interstate, that plan goes with them and they are able to be connected in with local supports near their new residence. So Northcott is the early childhood partner in Hunter, New England, and there's also Life Start on the Central Coast, and we'll talk a little bit more about areas as we go on. We assist families and carers to determine the right supports for children to meet their developmental goals. We provide referrals to services, strategies that families can use in their homes and also out in community. We help build the capacity of families to support their child's development, and we may support families through the NDIS process to access an NDIS plan. So this map shows the coverage of ECEI services. The dark blue on the right-hand map shows Northcott in Western Sydney, Hunter, New England, mid-coast or mid-north coast and the north coast. And as you can see, the Hunter, New England is quite a large region. And as of the 6th of June, Hunter, New England alone had 2,193 children sitting with NDIA in that 0 to 6 age group. So given the limitations of COVID-19, concerns of families about meeting and coming to offices, etc., we are expecting that once confidence returns to families and restrictions are somewhat lifted, that we will see quite a few children coming through the scheme or coming through in high numbers. Currently there are low numbers, so it's a good time to apply. And those low numbers are mirrored in comments that we're also hearing from service providers as well as many allied health providers. So we would expect a dramatic increase for children coming into the scheme, perhaps in the next quarter. So the other responsibility we have is to improve community connections and build community inclusion for children who have developmental issues or disability. So this may look like us working with a service, an organisation, a sporting group, etc., to develop their capacity to be inclusive for those children and build understanding around children of all abilities. We also provide support in this way to mainstream services by providing information. So especially important for families who may be in a crisis situation, and I'll use an example of a family threatened with homelessness. For people in crisis, it may be unlikely that they have capacity to support their child with strategies to meet their additional development needs, or even to take that first step to make application with ECEI. So as an organisation, we make sure that we always stay connected in and maintain good relationships with those family support type services who can perhaps provide a soft entry. For those people, we're happy to have those soft conversations and explain what the whole process is about and how we can help their child. The other thing is NDIS have also created a new role of people called community connectors, and they are people who will be hitting our communities soon, helping organisations and the community to be inclusive of people with disability. So I'm really quite excited to be working with them out in community once those roles launch. So this is how a family connects with Northcott. So first of all, connecting with the NDIS partner, which is Northcott, is about building capacity for families, and we're really relying heavily on the person who is the legal guardian. I'll refer to them as parent from now on, but it's really important for that parent to be contacting Northcott directly. So the family self-refers to Northcott, and if you're concerned that a parent doesn't have capacity to make the call, our recommendation is for your service to perhaps be with that parent, have them in the room and call Northcott, or even have them speak with them on speakerphone to support them through that call. NDIA have the same authority classifications as the ATO or Medicare, so unless we have consent from the family, unfortunately, or the legal guardian, unfortunately we can't take that application any further. So parents are then linked with a coordinator who will provide them with some further information and determine the support needs of the family. For example, they will establish if there's more than one child who may require support in that family. They might be looking at, does that child just require short-term intervention? And if a child does just require that intervention, Northcott can provide that for a period of up to 6 months, as well as connect that family in with community and mainstream supports. So this may be all that's required for a child to catch up with their peers, and they may not need to go on to full scheme access. Children who do require full scheme access, Northcott will support them with their NDIS application, and thereafter the coordinator will be monitoring that plan and monitoring on that child's progress. So this diagram shows the NDIS pathways or pathways for support. On the left, we have the hearing and vision. On the right is the 7 to 64, and in the middle, the 0 to 6 year age group. So on the left are their hearing and vision pathways. So children with only a hearing or vision impairment can apply directly through Australian Hearing or Australian Vision, which is a faster process than going through ECEI. But of course, we may also see some of those children come back through ECEI for further supports. Right-hand side is the 7 to 64 space. So those people are supported on their NDIS journey by local area coordinators. In this area, in a Hunt in New England, that would be Uniting, excuse me, and on the Central Coast, Social Futures. So people in this age group who are participants of NDIS will have a diagnosed permanent and lifelong disability. So in the centre is where Northcott comes in. Children 0 to 6 years old can access ECEI support from Northcott in parts of Western Sydney, Hunt in New England, Mid-North and North Coast. And for children applying for an NDIS plan, those aged 0 to 5 years old do not require a diagnosis. So do not require a diagnosis in a 0 to 5. However, the parent coordinator will need to be able to identify 2 or more areas of developmental concern to go on to have an NDIS plan. And a child who has a disability diagnosis will automatically be eligible to access the NDIS scheme and have a plan. So up until the age of 5, the focus is on developing the skills of the child to be equal to their peers. Prior to this age, from about the age of 4, we'll be starting to have discussions with families to let them know that by the age of 6, they will require a diagnosis to remain on the scheme. And in some cases, a child's development may have reached a point where they no longer are required to be on the scheme. But for those who will need to go on into that 7 to 64 space, preparation will start for them at the age of 6 years old when they will need to have that diagnosis. So we do have a short video to play. It's about a mother's experience accessing supports and discussing diagnosis and developmental delay. When we refer to diagnosis, we're referring to a condition that is lifelong and permanent and affecting the child's ability to participate in everyday activities. When we refer to developmental delay, similarly, it has an impact on everyday activities for the child. However, we may not necessarily know the cause, and this may be a short-term issue that can be improved by the implementation of strategies. So I'm just going to go into that video for you now.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I work for the NDIS. I have a personal motivation for wanting to work with people with disability. Our son lives with autism and ADHD. Early childhood, early intervention is for kids that are 0 to 6 years old. The children don't need to have a defined disability, so we can accept people onto the scheme that have a developmental delay. So for families that are out there that need to talk to somebody about asking for help, we have the 1-800 number. Then you'll be guided to the early childhood, early intervention partner. And that can be just sitting down having a conversation about what your child's needs are from there. Everybody has a basic human right to living an ordinary life, and the NDIS is going to help that happen for people. For more
Right, we're going to go back to our PowerPoint, if you bear with me for just a moment. There we go. Okay, so we have up here the domains that are used by Northcott to determine developmental delay. So those areas are self-care, communication and language, intellectual, physical, social and emotional, development, hearing, and also vision. So how do we record developmental delay? Well, we meet with the family, and in pre-COVID days, this was usually in a natural environment, perhaps in the home, sometimes at a preschool, sometimes even a park. And we look at the information provided. We ask lots of questions, check reports that could be coming from the GP, the preschool, the school, allied health providers, and we also do what's called the Ages and Stages questionnaire and do some observations. From here, we develop an access request form, which is an application form for NDIS, and this will be forwarded to NDIS. It's the NDIS who makes the decision of whether a child is approved access, and children with hearing and vision, as I mentioned earlier, are seen as a priority and can go through a direct pathway, providing there's no other developmental support we need to organise. For all access requests, the wait time with NDIS is currently 19 days, which is very fast compared to historically, so it's a very good time to be applying. So how soon should we have a discussion with the parent if we have concerns? It's never too early, as soon as possible. Some of the things either yourself or your administrative staff, receptionist, may hear coming from families are phrases like, people find it hard to understand my child. They don't understand when they speak. They're uncoordinated. They fall over a lot. Or they really struggle to settle at school. It's so really hard for them to learn. Or the preschool has said they're behind. Or a parent who is just not coping with their child's behaviours. So being familiar with some of these phrases becomes a way to recognise when your staff may be able to support a family by handing them an ECEI brochure, if it's appropriate. So when discussing early intervention, it's all about ensuring that strategies are applied early to have the most effective and long-lasting impact. Early interventions, particularly in the early childhood space, is considered best practice. It's evidence-based. Again, it's using an insurance model, and it's short, quick intervention in those early developmental years that will lead and build a child's skill for a more productive life. And we do have one more YouTube. I just ask you to bear with me again for a second.
Prior to the NDIS, all the states and territories in Australia had a different approach to early childhood intervention services. So given that the NDIS is now a national scheme, there was a real need to develop a consistent evidence-based approach that would work for early childhood intervention services throughout Australia. So if there's concerns around a child's development, there may be concerns that they're not developing as we would expect them to, the family might be referred to what we call an early childhood partner. Children who are aged 0 to 6 with a developmental delay or a disability may be eligible for early childhood early intervention under the NDIS.
When we were told that Elijah was diagnosed with Down syndrome, we didn't really know what to expect, and we didn't know what his needs were.
I had a few concerns with certain behaviours he was displaying, and I'd struggled for a while, thinking, oh no, it's me, I'm not handling it right, I'm not doing the right things. So I mentioned it to the maternal health people, and they said, oh yeah, you'd probably benefit if we get you some help. I had no idea that you didn't need a diagnosis. I thought you had to be told that there was something specific. So to be told, no, you actually can get help was a big relief. When Leah's been coming round, she's with the Early Childhood Early Intervention Coordinator. We watched his behaviour to try to figure out why he was doing things he was doing. So he was having a tantrum, and she explained, hold him tightly so that he feels nice and secure. It was something that never crossed my mind to do, but it actually really helps. He just wants to feel secure.
Our experience with NDIS has been very positive. We feel like we have a really good plan for all of our future, and that Elijah will grow and develop and be able to become independent in his life.
It's had a huge impact. The whole household's a lot calmer because we bounce off him. We'll tend to do more things as a family now, rather than Jagger being left behind or me just taking Jagger and nobody else wanting to come. It's kind of brought us all together again.
It's really important to take a long-term view, that it is a journey that you're on, and that you don't have to have everything perfect for your first plan, because it evolves. You can have it reviewed if you don't feel something is right. But I think we found this year we learned a lot, and so for our second plan we were able to make modifications to make it better.
I'd say if you've got concerns, definitely listen to your gut instinct. Go and speak to somebody sooner rather than later. Go and see your GP or go and see the maternal health nurse. Just speak to them, explain your concerns, and they'll help you get the help that you need. As the approach starts to roll out across the country, there'll be opportunity for families in local areas to participate in early childhood, early intervention information sessions. So they'd be really good to go to get more information and to help them to prepare for that transition into the NDIS. And there's also some resources around getting ready to do a plan, so families can access those resources on the NDIS website.
Okay, so back to our PowerPoint. So we have up here our last PowerPoint slide, which is the contact details for Northcott, 1-800-818-286. We also have the direct number for NDIS on there for people who are wishing to contact NDIS. My details are on there, and Sue Lloyd's email is also there. And we also have LifeStart's number down the bottom, which is 1-800-953-390. So the next thing I'm going to be going to is some of the barriers that we mentioned earlier. So one of the hardest things for families can be a fear of labels, and that often will stop them from accessing the supports they could be accessing with ECEI. It's really important that we let people know that the whole purpose of ECEI is to focus on that child's development, and hopefully by implementing certain strategies and supports that we can actually bring those skill levels up for the child. And they may not necessarily need access to the scheme on an ongoing basis. I sometimes use myself as an example with an analogy in learning. I'm quite good at maths, maybe not so good at, quite good at English, maybe not so good at maths. So I'd see probably a tutor if I wanted to bring the level of that up. Similarly, for some people with children, they might run like the wind, maybe have trouble with their speech, not quite as developed. So by implementing some strategies, getting some support, we can bring that up. So that's a very simple way to explain to families in a really non-threatening way that accessing supports is a helpful thing. So another thing that can have significant impact could be historical experience. We do have parents who do have a fear of removal of children and fear that any developmental delay could possibly be a reflection on their parenting skills. And we're always really careful to assure parents who may have concerns that sometimes developmental delay just happens, and perhaps with some supports, that's something that can be helped. Parents also sometimes may feel quite overwhelmed by the whole process, especially if English is their second language. And there also can be cultural impacts, especially around the word disability. So Northcott has made some quite strategic methods of linking in with both our Indigenous and our multicultural communities, and we have both Indigenous and multicultural staff amongst our coordinators. We're always aware that we may not gather all the essential information from families in perhaps just one or even two visits, and if a parent over a period of time needs to meet with a coordinator a number of times for us to have that holistic and accurate view of that family and that child's situation, then we're quite flexible around that, and that's what we will do in that situation. So how can your office help? So I guess the first big one is to have brochures freely available, and we can certainly post those out to you or drop them in, but have brochures available. The other area is, as we mentioned earlier, perhaps there'd be a staff member who would be able to support parents to make that call to Northcott if they're not feeling comfortable in that space and feel like they need that support. And the other thing is, if you could let families know if they do have English as a second language, or they if they communicate through Auslan, that Northcott does have access to interpreters. So we're going to launch straight into some questions that were asked on the evening. Is Northcott only in our region, or is it an umbrella organisation like My Aged Care? So the answer would be that really NDIA, NDIS is the umbrella, and Northcott is a partner under that umbrella, and we're the face for NDIS out in community. So we collect information, excuse me, on behalf of NDIS in the 0 to 6 year old space in the areas that we referred to earlier. Next question, does Northcott provide services or just access to NDIS? Good question. We don't provide funded services for children 0 to 6 in the areas that we are a partner in the community. And for this audience, I'm referring to the Hunter New England. So we may provide for supports in those areas for people in the 7 to 64-year-old space and other areas. But to be organising access and also providing supports would be a conflict of interest for us. So we support families to access a number of portals, a number of options so that they can decide on which service provider to use, and we can't really advocate for any particular service provider either. Next question, can families only access NDIS in this age group through Northcott? So NDIS does prefer access requests to come through the early childhood partners such as Northcott in this area, so that we can provide feedback on whether they'll make access or not, and also to be able to provide people with that short-term support if they don't meet access. Families can access the online request forms, which are application forms, and this is mainly for families in rural and remote areas. They can download the form, print it off, complete it, and send it into an ECEI partner such as Northcott. That's a fairly new point of access that has not been available for too long. Is Northcott funded by the federal government? Yes, we're funded by NDIA, which is federal funding. Next question from a GP. I have been doing autism and ADHD assessments for children. How do I become part of the NDIS team? We will talk a bit further around being a provider. But as far as assessments go, there is what they call List A, and that has a list of disabilities that will qualify for access. For example, ASD level 2. If we have an application where the child has ASD level 2, then their application will be sent with a report to the National Access Team for them to authorise access for that child. Next question, how do we provide details of assessment to support access? Fantastic. It's important for feedback to be on the impact of a development of that on that child's everyday activities. So whatever that developmental issue is, what is the impact on that child's everyday life? It's really important for coordinators to be able to gather that information as well as hear that family story. That's if they are able to get a report, and it helps determine the type of supports a child will have as well as the frequency of those supports. So how do we become an NDIS service provider? There are links on the NDIS website to the service provider toolkit, which I will provide a link for. And there's quite a thin market for service provision here in the Hunter New England. So if you'd like to be a registered provider, we would encourage you to go along to the NDIS website and have a look, particularly in the New England area. Very few providers, very thin on the ground, and actually also Gloucester, quite thin on the ground there as well. So some of the models that are being looked at the moment, and there may be opportunities for you to look at, particularly in New England, would be to provide an outreach service. So an outreach face-to-face service, periodically with supplementary telehealth sessions in between. So we had a comment come through, health versus disability. This discussion is frustrating, and certainly hearing you there. If a family is provided with reports from an allied health provider, there's certainly considered helpful information to support the child's application and for the building of the plan. They're not mandatory for the child in the 0 to 5 year old age group, but certainly helpful. And I think we hear probably more frustration on health versus disability in that 7 to 64 space, where, you know, it can be sometimes appear to be quite ambiguous where that falls. So at what point do you send a child for a diagnosis, and how do you choose where to send them? So the family chooses who they will use for the diagnosis. From about the age of 4, we'll start having conversation with parents that if they're going to continue with a scheme from 6 on, that they will need a diagnosis. And we know that there can be significant delays in getting an appointment. So that's why we start those conversations quite early. Northcott can't recommend who to use because that would be a conflict of interest again under our contract. Okay, another really good comment. An attendee expressed concern that Northcott could be a monopoly provider. So once Northcott was contracted to NDIA, we were unable to provide funded supports for children in the areas where we are an ECEI partner. So for this audience, that's the Hunter New England. So we are able to provide initial supports for those children, for children in any area, and that comes from our NDIS funding to cover that. And it's part of our contract that we are expected to provide some short-term supports, initial supports for children. So if a child has an NDIS plan, for example, and they're funded for a speech therapist, they won't be accessing a Northcott speech therapist. But we'll just use Tamworth as an example though. In Tamworth, there is only one early childhood speech therapist in the town, and Northcott's the ECEI partner there, and we are strong. They're actually the early childhood speech therapist is actually a Northcott speech therapist. So we strongly encourage parents to go to another speech pathologist in that early childhood space, because as we mentioned, it will be a conflict of interest. As we also mentioned, we need more providers in that area if you're thinking of going there. So if a family did wish to use Northcott's speech therapist, there's extremely strict conflict of interest criteria that must be overcome before a family is able to actually access them. So funding the diagnostic pathway. So this question, with a child under 5, where parents are concerned their child has autism, but they do not have the funds for a formal diagnosis. If we refer children to you, are they able to have access to funding to fund that initial assessment? So the answer is no. The NDIA doesn't fund assessments for access, but that has actually been their decision on that, their stance on that since the trial in 2013. So next question regarding the previous example. If the parents are concerned that their child under the age of 5 may have autism, what practical things are you able to do for that family? So we would meet with the family, we do the ages and stages questionnaire, complete our own documentation under those developmental domains. For example, child may be not meeting social interaction and communication levels, then they would meet access to early intervention if they're under 6 years old. And that means that they could go on to have an NDIS plan. So the next area, would they, for example, get access to a psychologist? So they'd have a plan built based on their support needs. Capacity building supports are flexible, so if they have funding there for therapists, that can be used amongst a variety of therapists if required. If they need psychology, they have therapy funding, yes, the answer is yes. So the next question. So rather than sending a child under 6 for a diagnosis before applying for NDIS, they can apply under ECEI and get supports, possibly therapies, whilst waiting to get a diagnosis. Absolutely yes. If in doubt, have the families apply. You know, even in the worst case scenario and they don't meet access, they will still be able to access those initial supports and be connected in to community and mainstream supports for up to 6 months. But yes, always, if that's the only takeaway from tonight, don't wait for a diagnosis. As soon as that family requires help, just refer them in. But if they're 6, they will require that diagnosis. Okay. So the early childhood, early intervention pathway, health pathways appears to be rather circular. I wasn't sure whether this was referring to a link on one of your internal websites, so I'll leave that alone if that's the case. But apart from that, Northcott has been around for 2 years or over 2 years. So we're also aware that in health, in the PEDS section, they have the first 2,000 days program around children in their first 5 years of life. And we are working with them, trying to link in so as to complement that program with them and not actually duplicate that, but to work with them, which would be great. So once the child meets access, Northcott gathers the information and we consider the impacts and support requirements of the child and family. We gather that information, we form that into a draft NDIS plan. That goes to NDIS. An NDIS delegate decides if the plan meets reasonable and necessary criteria. And then the delegate may also sometimes contact a Northcott coordinator to seek more information or to ask why a support has been allocated, or questions over the amount of support allocated. All decisions are made by the NDIS delegate, and they will also provide information if they decide to decline a support. So Northcott will then go back to the family, the coordinator will go back and explain what has been approved and explain why a support has been declined if that is the case. Next question, once funding is allocated, what is the process if they wish to change providers? So we always discuss informed choice with families, have a chat around choosing a provider most suitable for your child, research providers, find someone with the best fit, and we encourage them to check service agreements before signing those as well. They might look at how does the therapist provide best practice for you? Would that be in a group or one-on-one or in a natural environment? And we encourage them to have a set of questions to ask providers so they can drill down on what's best for them. Next question, how can GPs be an advocate where parents have concerns over docs being called? Yeah. So as this is a voluntary scheme that requires parental consent, if you're concerned for the parent for when they're going to call, that's when being on the phone with them or being with them in the room might allay some of those fears. We're also happy to meet with families in another trusted space. It could be at a parent support group, it could be at a community centre, a parent support service, or at a place where they feel comfortable, but it is always very difficult to have those conversations regards little people. But we'll always try and provide the best avenue we can for people. So how can I help you? So I'm happy to provide supporting GP practices as a whole to help families in this space. I can come and present to your staff at practice or team meetings and discuss the types of conversations that might come up with families where to prompt them, giving out brochures, chat just a little bit around the access and pathways that we've spoken about today. Another option is I'm quite happy to pop out there and have a connection desk for a day and just be available in your waiting rooms, for example, for any families that might like to just have a chat about early childhood, early intervention and what that looks like and how to get access, etc. So that's all. I've talked enough, I think. I've talked your ears off. So I will say thank you for listening, and I hope this has been helpful, maybe simplified things a little. Please email through any questions you have. Happy to respond to those or provide other support that we can. Okay, bye for now.